No worries. I want to start with you, Steve, if I can. And in my
Sure.
introduction, I referred to you
Hmm.
as Asian American, and I was reading an interesting
Right.
article on the Fighting Stripes website recently
Right. Right.
from one of the great authors on there, and
Hmm.
he mentioned about the moniker Asian American and I guess how that makes him feel as someone who's effectively born and raised in the US. How it's always Asian first and American second, and I guess how that unconsciously impacts how people view him and how people view other Asian Americans as well. So I just want to start there. How
Right.
do you view that term Asian American? Is that something that you've ever thought of, that you're perhaps viewed as Asian first and American second, despite the fact you've spent most of your life in the US?
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's always it's a very broad term. I mean, I'm sure Seo-In here can tell you about that as well. But I think every single one of us Asian Americans, Korean Americans, whoever it may be, we all have our own definition of what Asian American really is. Because I was born in Korea. I grew up there when I was really young, and then I moved to the U.S. and I went to school here. And I have my idea of what a Korean American would would be like in terms of how we go about living our life. But I grew up in New York. I mean, I grew up in New York. I grew up in LA. I grew up in big cities where there are really big Asian American population. But for somebody like Soin here, he grew up in, I believe, in Kansas City. Is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
and I
Suburbs
mean,
outside of Kansas City. Yeah.
right, and that's a completely different life experience. I've never
Right.
even been to Kansas, to be honest with you, but it's
Mm.
so for everyone it's different. I've got Korean American friends who are from Florida. I've got Korean American friends who are one of my best friends. He's actually from Seattle. So all these people, they have different experiences and they all have different lifestyles, but I think it's easy for people who are on the outside to sort of make assumptions as to make sweeping generalization as to who we really are. But all of us are different. Like Soin and I, we're both Korean Americans, but I'm 100% sure that the way we were brought up, the way we grew up, how our experiences were going to school and all that, it was probably completely different. And
Mm.
to
Absolutely.
be and to be fair, I think Soin probably had more struggles than I did in terms of developing his identity as a Korean American, because I grew up in LA and in New York, where I had a lot of peers who were just like me, Korean
Mm.
Americans, or Koreans who actually moved to America and things like that. But growing up in Kansas, I can't even really imagine. He probably grew up around people that look nothing like him, and I'm sure that's a different
Right.
experience as well. So I think for everybody, it's a different experience, really.
I'll come to you, Sharon, and we'll talk about that now. What was your experience like, growing up as a Korean American, as Steve just mentioned there, in Kansas City, which is far removed from perhaps where the big Korean American populations are? Is there a period of time it takes for you to be comfortable in your own skin and with your own culture as well? Are you so concerned about fitting in that you perhaps almost shun your own culture to try and fit in?
And it was definitely an interesting one. I think there's a fine line, and like Steve was saying, there's no one big umbrella that encompasses or generalizes what a Korean American is. And me in particular, being from Kansas City, or a place where typically it was, it was a lot of suburb white communities. And so, obviously looking around growing up as a kid, no one really looks like you. But I feel like I was on more of, lack of a better term, like a better side of things where, I was athletic at a young age and I never kind of had this identity crisis where I felt like I didn't quite fit in. So in terms of that, I felt okay. But did I witness and was I kind of a bystander and seeing my own people being a little bit discriminated for some of the kids who maybe just, let's say, stay in school and just working to become a mathematician or striving to be
Mm.
more academic? Sure, I saw it, and I feel like my duty at a young age, which is why I'm still so passionate about it today, is because I was kind of hoping to be the change even at a young age, to tell them, look, listen, these guys are just like me. They're not what you see on TV, they're not what you see on Netflix, where in Hollywood it's oftentimes depicted as that. And so I was hoping at a young age that I could kind of pave the way and show people that Asian Americans aren't supposed to be just one stereotype. And so I had an interesting upbringing because, at a young age, I was traveling a lot for soccer. And, I didn't really have an issue personally, but am I invalidating or saying that there weren't issues around me? There were, absolutely, and I was firsthand witness.